We are students of the art of play,
And we do this show called The Art of Play.
a show for the players who ask why.
I'm Vi.
And I'm Gaia.
Gaia, what are we talking about today?
So today we're going to bounce immediately off of our previous episode on designing for game balance and talk about something that came up quite a lot in there that people don't tend to talk about in usual game discussions. Cooperative games.
Yes.
Now, I know you have been excited for this topic. It was one that you brought to me, I think, last week when we were doing our episode planning.
Yeah.
So
I just dropped it at your doorstep like a cat bringing you a mouse.
that was exactly what
It was
happened.
exactly it. I just went cooperative games and I left.
So in this episode, we're again not going to be talking as in-depth about a concept of here's how games do game design. Instead, we're going to make the case for cooperative games. The idea here is that when we talk about games, you hear about two kinds most often. Insert single-player game here of any genre, and insert competitive game here of any genre.
Yes.
What we don't often hear about, except in the context of specifically Stardew Valley, is cooperative games. Games you explicitly have to work with other players for success. Even games that are ostensibly cooperative,
Yes.
people talk about competitively, like survival games.
This being distinctly different from games that have a multiplayer, right? This is a game that is designed to have another player. This isn't an individual game where you happen to also be able to play it with somebody else. This is a game that is made to be played with someone else.
Although games that let you be single player or cooperative are also fully valid here. Portal 2 being an
yes.
example of that. Baldur's Gate being an example of that.
For sure. There's a different kind of cooperative that we're trying to narrow in on, which is a little bit sort of the asymmetrical play thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with this, why don't I let you open it up, Vi, and tell us what are cooperative games? Why should we care?
Well, I think for me, cooperative games represent something that is very different from like standard gaming, right? Where when we look at like the development of games over time, or the evolution of games rather, you know, we see games that you play against the computer, and then you see games that you play against other people, and then different ways to play games against somebody. And that becomes something that is really challenging, right? Like if you think of, like, I grew up in a household with my brother, right? You know, we want to play a game together, but we don't want to be like fighting against each other because we're trying to do something together, right? And that's where a cooperative game can really shine, because we should care about working with other people, right?
Yeah.
Every other aspect of your life, aside from like competitive video games, you know, or other competitions, but it tends to be working with people, being cooperative and solving problems.
I can actually think back to one of our previous episodes when we talked about the different types of players. I can't remember the term for it. Bartle's taxonomy, I want to say it was. Where
That sounds right.
Yeah, where we separated players into those who wanted to socialize and be friendly and those who wanted to kill other players in online games.
Yes.
And we talked about how these socializing players tend to help everybody, but these killing players tend to push them away by making an unfriendly environment.
Yeah.
And most of our discussions since then have been about games where those killing players are prominent or where there's no multiplayer at all.
Yeah.
So today, let's talk about those social, friendly, helping players who want to work with each other.
Yes.
So let's get a clear picture of what a cooperative game is. And I'll throw this back to you, Vi. In as few words as possible, what is a cooperative game? And then in as many words as possible, what is a cooperative game?
As few words as possible is not a strong skill of mine.
As few as possible for you might be a little bit better.
Yeah. It is a game in which you and another player or another group of players cooperate to solve problems within the game.
So you must work together
Yes.
to achieve a goal.
Yes,
So being fully independent is not realistic.
correct.
And being against each other is not realistic.
Yes.
To quote unquote win, you must be a team and do things together.
yes.
Okay. So that gives us a picture of what a cooperative game is. Now, let's go into a little bit more detail.
Sure.
So, Vi, if I had to ask you, what are some of the main aspects of cooperative games? What makes a game cooperative besides just teamwork? What do you think of?
What makes a game cooperative besides teamwork?
Yeah, like besides just saying, you're all working together, cool. What differences exist in these cooperative games? How are they different?
From competitive games?
Yeah, or from single player games. Because I can
What a good question.
I can think of one right away.
Go for it.
And that's each task that you have to complete in the game is often incompletable without another player there.
Yes.
This isn't like D&D where a single person can do a role to achieve something. This is something like in our previous discussion on Portal 2, where in Portal 2's cooperative multiplayer, you have two players doing two different puzzles who have to pass resources between each other
Yes.
to do their own puzzle.
Yeah, where
And-
you cannot finish that part of the game without help from your partner.
Yeah, you can also imagine in a game like Baldur's Gate, where every single fight in that game is functionally impossible without your entire party.
Yeah.
I've seen people trying to do single character runs in those games. It is a nightmare. You're just
Yeah.
grinding all game.
Yeah.
Right? You can imagine that games that are cooperative fundamentally require this cooperative element. Though I can also think of another main feature of cooperative games, and that's a high variety of play. It's very rare for you to find a cooperative game where everybody in the game has to do the same thing. Actually, I can think of effectively none. But what you often see is that in these cooperative games, everybody can pick a different role or a different thing that they're good at and work towards a common good.
Yes.
I'm drawn to Stardew Valley when I think of games this way,
Sure.
where, yeah, everyone could do the same thing, but it doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
You need a farmer and a fisher and a miner and a fighter and a
Yeah.
forager, and you need people to be doing things in Stardew Valley
Yeah, if you
towards
want
a common goal.
if you wanted to do all of those things, why are you playing with other people? Right? I think that's the thing that it gets down to for me. It's like
Yeah.
if you wanted to play an individual game, why aren't you playing an individual game?
Now-
or why isn't this game an individual strategy game?
Now, Stardew Valley is unique in some ways, though. It can be a fully individual game. Adding players quite literally just adds players,
Yeah.
which goes against part of our early definition. But importantly, adding players makes previously impossible tasks possible. And I think
Yes.
this is another important way to think about cooperation. In single-player Stardew Valley, it is extremely hard to complete the community center in the first year. That's the big goal for speedrunners. But when you have two people, one of you does half the goals, one of you does the other half,
Yeah.
it becomes much more reasonable. Then when you have 3 and 4, it becomes even more reasonable. Previously difficult or near impossible goals become manageable.
Right.
You can also think of how much money you need to earn to exponentially grow your farm, right? In single player, you're limited by your energy. In 4 players, you're limited by your imagination for how to do this growth.
You should do the marketing for co-op Stardew Valley. Normal Stardew Valley, limited by, material constraints. Cooperative?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also modded, I guess, can have the same quote. But like in Stardew Valley,
Yeah, fair enough.
they're about to up the number of players that can have in a single game. It used to be
Yeah.
a maximum of 4, and I think it's going maximum of 8. Imagine 8 people in a single Stardew world.
Unhinged.
But that's the beauty of cooperative, is that by working together, you can achieve things you previously couldn't.
Yep.
Now, there are a lot of cooperative games out there, and we don't talk about them very often. So I want to talk about the various types of cooperative games in this discussion. And
Awesome.
I think I talked about this in the notes I sent you. I really hope that I did.
Sure.
But there are mainly 2 kinds of cooperative games, maybe 3 that I can think of. The first one is what I'm going to call the independent cooperative game. This is the game where you can play alone, or with 2, or with 3, or with 4, and having more people doesn't change the game, it changes the opportunities.
Yes, this is the playing Baldur's Gate 3 with your friends and the Stardew Valley of games.
Yeah, Stardew Valley and Baldur's Gate, just what we've talked about. Then there's the...
I love this game. I love this show because we just talk about games that we like and are currently playing, and then we get to use them in tons of different examples.
It's
just,
really
it's
fun.
just good because I get to think about what's happening in those games.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The next type of game that I think is very important here is the strictly cooperative game. This is where you and at least one more person must be together to complete the basic tasks of the game.
This is Unsolved Murder and
Portal 2.
Well, Portal 2, but what is the one where you're trapped in a castle?
Oh, I have no clue.
Oh, I will find it.
But yeah, so there's the strictly cooperative game where you must work together. And then I think there's one more type of cooperative game, and that's the asymmetrical cooperative game. Now, there is one really good example that we don't stop talking about on the show of asymmetrical cooperative games.
Yeah. Sorry, I just found the game. It's called We Were Here.
Cool.
Yeah.
But there's one really good example of asymmetrical cooperative games, and that's D&D.
Yeah.
And I want to say it this way. Let's think about TTRPGs for a second, because I feel like this is something complicated. It's quite obvious to think this game's cooperative because we work together as independent beings. This game's cooperative because we are a team that must work together.
Yeah.
But D&D is also cooperative. Not just with your party, but with the DM.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you might have something good to say on this one, Vi. Why is D&D cooperative?
Oh, what a loaded question.
Or what makes D&D cooperative?
Well, like, the nature of the game is that it must be cooperative, right?
Why?
I just want you to imagine a scenario where you sit down and you have your DM and 3 players who are actively trying to play the game in sort of, the traditional way, and one person who is not doing that. The game simply doesn't work. Like, split narratives can happen, but you don't play the game that way. It's horrible to play that game that way.
Well,
right?
Yeah, but let's think about it this way. The party in D&D is inherently a strictly cooperative party.
Yes.
With no DM, that's the same as Baldur's Gate. Strictly cooperative.
Yes.
But
the
the
DM
DM is also playing a cooperative game with you.
Yes. But
How?
they're playing a different game, like we talked about in the last episode, that is fundamentally different because their role is of the world, right? They are responsible for being the game, right? If you remove the DM from D&D, you've just got a bunch of fools,
Sitting in a room. Talking, probably.
Yeah,
Maybe
right?
eating chips.
You're just hanging out, which is great, but it's not playing D&D, right?
But let's think what happens when we say D&D isn't cooperative. There are 2 possibilities. Imagine a DM that is actively competitive against the players.
Yeah.
Their goal is to beat their players.
Yeah.
I summon a beholder, I win. Or even, here's a balanced party, I am going to try to TPK you all.
Yeah.
Or, I'm adding survival mechanics. Food, water, shelter, bedding, clothing. You must manage them all or you die.
Yeah.
It's rainy, now you're wet and bogged down. Like,
Yeah.
those things can be fun. And if you're aiming for fun, and that's what your party wants, it's a cooperative again.
Mm-hmm.
You're giving a challenge to your players that they want to experience.
Yeah.
But otherwise, you're just trying to attack your players. And imagine being a player that is fighting against God. Like actual God.
It doesn't, well, it just doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
Like, the game falls apart when you start, like, taking the cooperative part of the game out of the game.
Yeah, if your DM isn't focused on your fun as a player, you're just going to be constantly dying, going up against things that are unfair to you, fighting enemies that are just designed to kill you, and re-rolling characters constantly.
This is a thing that happened in the development of D&D. And I might be slightly apocryphal in my facts of this, but there was a point where I believe it was Gary Gygax, or one of the developers of Dungeons & Dragons, was really frustrated with how quickly DMs would let their players level up, and was like, well, because what do you do after you hit level 20, right? Like, you're gods now, and you're going to keep playing and winning because everything is statted differently. So he developed a dungeon that was unbeatable and then published it to be like, punish your players for being powerful because they simply cannot get through this, right? And it's like, why is that fun? You just developed the worst game, right?
You literally are making the game unplayable for the players.
There is no win case in this thing, right? Because you're playing, like, even planning it before and then being very truthful about, like, not improving anything, right? Not being like, oh, and there's another room with a beholder in it, and sticking to your plan. You've made something unbeatable, like, unkillable.
Which, for your players, there might be a fun challenge of seeing how far you can go.
For sure.
But that's a discussion with your players for the purpose of them
purpose
having
of-
fun.
yeah.
Let's compare this to another game. Imagine you pick up a shooter, your level whatever. Let's say not even shooters. Let's say it's CS:GO, the most basic of, like, fundamental shooters. And you're playing CS:GO, and suddenly the game spawns just an enemy with triple health who's unheadshotable on the team. On the enemy team, whose goal it is to just go straight for you and kill you.
Yeah.
And then when you beat them, it spawns a stronger one. And then when you beat them, the game takes away your weapons.
Yes.
Like, sure, there's some fun to be had in this challenge.
Yes.
But doing this without consent, you close the game because obviously the game doesn't want you to have fun. It's just trying to ruin your life.
The game doesn't actually want you to play the game. And that's the problem with doing it like that. I will say that there is, cases, right, in the same way that, this dungeon could be how far can you get, where spawning, sequentially less or sequentially more challenging, more dangerous things is something that happens. Like I was playing Baldur's Gate 3 because that's the thing I'm playing. But there's one room that I was in, and this isn't really spoilers because I won't tell you where it is or where it fits in the story arc. But the thing is just survive 5 turns of combat, right? So you've got your whole party in there, and it's just don't die. And that's it, right? And that is a very cool way to be like, fight something super powerful and just see how, like,
yeah,
how
and there's
many
a win
of them
condition.
can I kill? There's
the
a win
condition is 5 turns later.
Yes. Which
It's
is
live.
great. Yeah, as opposed to just we keep doing that until somebody,
Yeah. But let's now think about this the other way. So we just gave a whole description of what happens if God is hostile against you. Your DM. What if your DM's hostile against you? What if the players are competitive against the DM? So this is something that I need to say that's from the DM books and from most people who talk about D&D. The DM is a player trying to have fun, but they build the world and they're having fun with world building and seeing how their own world evolves with other people's actions.
Yeah.
How do people behave in my world is the fun part for the DM.
Yes.
And how do I behave in an unpredictable world is the fun part for the player.
Correct.
What happens when your players are instinctively competitive against the DM?
First of all, that sounds bad. Like, it sounds deeply unpleasant.
I would say most players come into D&D expecting to be competitive against what the DM throws against them.
Yeah, sure. I will say, like, a new player probably would come in being like, oh, well, there's a win condition, and I want to meet the win condition.
Yeah. I actually think this is one of the biggest problems of new players.
Yeah, fair enough. The unnecessarily antagonism of, like, no, hang on. I'm not your enemy. I present to you the enemies.
Yeah.
But it's not me. I'm not doing it because I have malice in my heart. My heart is not blackened by years of being a DM.
Yeah.
I just have a host of monsters, and I'm giving them to you to fight, and I'm giving you challenges. It's not because I have a problem.
And it's really hard as a player to divorce this idea of I'm hostile against enemies, the DM controls the enemies, so I'm hostile against the DM. No, that you don't take that last step.
Yes. I think that's also why, like, playing in person will always be, like, my choice of playing D&D because, and like, I'm including, like, a voice call in this realm, but it's really easy just to be like, hang on, I need a second. Like, why are we hostile right now, right? Or just to pause the game and just go, hey, guys, I know this situation is bad. I just want us to remember that we're all friends sitting at the table, right? I know you're in a challenging position, like a player just died or something. Let's take a break, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen in video games.
It doesn't. So here's a question to you, Vi. What happens in D&D when a player is hostile against the DM? How can it go wrong? Because I can think of one right away.
Sure.
As a DM, I say, here's your quest. And the player, hostile to the DM, says,
I won't be doing that.
I will do everything but that.
Yes.
I will go over to this new area, do this new thing, do that. And I know this sounds weird, but how do I explain?
Like actively not picking up the plot hook is a way of being like, I don't want to play your game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's also when you get in the mindset of the DM's goal is to be against you because they're sending monsters after you, they're sending puzzles after you, they're creating things that make your life difficult. They must be against you. And when you get caught in that headset, you can view everything the DM does as against you.
Yeah.
So they give you a quest and you're like, this is against me. I should not do it, or I should be suspicious or do things wrong. It's like when players are suspicious of every NPC and openly hostile because they think the DM's against them.
Yeah.
And the DM,
well,
there's no game left.
There's no game. It's like, I'm giving you characters, and the choices you make will then inform it's the jail condition, right? Like, if you lived your whole life doing that, right? If you were a D&D character who thought that everybody was against you and every person you meet is hostile, no one's going to help you, right?
Yeah.
When you need a hand, there isn't going to be anybody there. No one's going to sell you anything, like, right? No one's going to do the D&D stuff.
But imagine also being a DM who puts all this time and effort and work into making a world and making a game for your players, and then your players just say, no, we're not doing that. You don't get your world. You don't get the things you built. You don't get the combat you designed. And I know it might be a little bit...
No, I think we're walking the line between, like, what is the player's preference for being railroaded versus
Yes.
open world?
But
right?
also, you can only make so much content as a DM, and that's a discussion you have to have.
Yeah.
But what I more mean is imagine making the content, and your players actively choosing to do what they can to avoid your content.
Yeah. This just sounds like a bad table to be at.
It does.
Yeah.
Like, it's one of those cases where you as a DM can't have fun because all the effort you put in is wasted, and now you have to put in so much more effort you can't even have fun.
Yes. Or
right?
you choose to walk away from it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So not only can a DM be hostile against the players, which is the thing you hear about most often, players can and often are hostile against the DM.
Yeah.
Right? And like, there's other forms of hostilities. And this is going to sound wild. A player who min-maxes is being, in most cases, hostile against the DM.
Well, yes, but I would also argue that sometimes min-maxing is being hostile against character narrative.
Which is, in essence,
which
against
is
the DM.
against the DM, but it's removed. It's not about the person, it's about the condition under which you play the game.
But like, I played D&D, and I had one character who did... I was DMing an old game, and this one person made his character to min-max every single ability, every single stat, everything, and even was trying to bend the rules to get more out of it. And eventually I hit a point where I don't know if I talked to him. I think I redesigned encounters around it, which is how you should handle this. But at some point I was talking to one of the other players, and I'm like, this guy outshines everybody at the table. Every encounter needs to be completely unfair because of this one guy.
Yeah.
Everything I do is going to get wasted because he bends the rules and rules lawyers me. And I will, every time I try to counter him, it's a 10, 20-minute discussion just for us to play a game.
Yeah.
How do I handle this? And like, I should never have had to have that discussion. I should have talked to the player long before that.
sure.
But this was my
Yeah.
first major time DMing. I didn't
Right.
know that. And this is a cooperative game.
Yeah. This is do you like, when you sit down at a table to play D&D, I don't think that you should look at it as any kind of competitiveness, right? Because it's different to like redirect energy, right? Like I had like my family plays our Christmas game, right? And my brother was trying to argue that like, oh, well, if I'm holding this guy, I should be able to use him like a human shield. And I was like, I think you're going to really struggle with that because, he's moving, you have to keep his mouth closed so he can't cast spells, right? Which means that you are actively disadvantaged against moving to intercept a missile, right? So I think that we're just going to roll it flat because we can argue about advantage, disadvantage, or about how to change your armor class based on this. But like rules is written, there's no condition here that says that you can do that, right? So you can either explain your way through to, this is why we're going to follow the rules as we have them, right? Or, like, I understand what you're trying to do, but I don't think it's going to give you the benefit you want. So let's just play it straight.
Yeah. Or you could even do a thing of, I will try to make this work for you,
Yes.
but there's limits, and
Yes.
now we have to engage those limits.
Yes. Or you implement a rule of cool where it's like, you can do this once.
You
never get to do this again.
My favorite example is when players ask, does your game include flanking? And my response has always been the same, and it's always gotten the same result. Do you want enemies to flank you? And every time the players are like, no.
Yeah. which is great because that's a good way of communicating like this game has to be fair, right?
Yeah.
And all of the characters that I represent have to have the same conditions that you have.
Yeah. It really communicates to the players that, like, I'm also playing this game, and your goal is not to be the strongest thing on earth that beats all the fights easily. The goal is to have fun combat.
Yes. The goal is to like interact with the story of the game.
Or even just have fun fights. Even just
fun fights. Like,
that
that's
you
totally a
don't
thing.
automatically win and find boring.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, my thing is always that fight should further narrative. And if you're having a fight without furthering narrative, why are you fighting?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Although I've definitely played some games where the goal of the game is just do some really cool fights.
Yeah, it's the one shots though of like
It's the one-shots.
we're just doing this just to see what can happen.
Yeah, let's have some fun with a cool fight. So that gives us a picture of 3 types of cooperative games, and for one of the more unique ones, how things really go wrong. To summarize, because that was a really long discussion on it,
There's just a lot of D&D talk right there.
it was.
Yeah.
We have the independent cooperative game, where all the players are independent actors, but together they make a better collective.
This is Stardew Valley, D&D loosely.
Yeah, Baldur's Gate especially kind of
Yeah.
fits this.
The multiplayer of Baldur's Gate is so good.
It is. And then we have the strictly cooperative games, which are like Portal, or in many ways also Baldur's Gate for certain things, because you need to have your party with you. Just you can play single player and the party's NPCs.
Yeah.
So if that counts as a cooperative or not is a completely different discussion. So I'm just gonna put it in both categories.
Sure.
But strictly cooperative means you must be together for this.
Yes.
Like a game like It Takes Two, which is required to have two people.
This is It Takes Two, Unsolved Mystery, which has a second chapter that I don't remember the name of, and we were here.
Yeah. And then we have the imbalanced cooperative, or the asymmetrical cooperative, where you have a DM and players usually. But anything where it's cooperative but you are fundamentally different.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of these games also fit into strictly cooperative, but I wanted to create its own category because how you handle cooperation is so fundamentally different.
Yeah, I think there's also something to be said here about like a tabletop RPG will always be different as a cooperative game than a board game or a video game, right? Like just because you have a rule set doesn't necessarily mean that your cooperation like ends at the rules.
Yeah. What I also want to say here, although this isn't going to be the focus of the episode, is there is also what I'm going to call sub-cooperation. For example, in a competitive game with teams, you are cooperative with your team. And that is actually something important. You don't just balance the game for how the teams fight. Right. You have to balance the game for how members of a team cooperate.
You are talking about cooperation within a team where the team is competitive against another team.
Yeah. So sub-cooperation is equally important here. And most of what we say, like in our descriptions and how we do cooperation and why it's important, applies to teams.
Yeah.
The issue is, when you're in a team, you have to think both competitively and cooperatively, and we would like to get kind of down to the pure cooperation.
Yeah.
So it's something that I think is important. I want to say that cooperative elements exist within nearly every game that is multiplayer, and not 1v1 whatever, other than chess, basically.
Well, but even chess is one of those things that like you can cooperate with your opponent
to learn. But it's not
right? But
it's not a cooperative
game.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just the point I'm trying to make sort of largely is just that cooperation exists in every game at different levels. Even in, when it's not baked into the game, it's still there because human existence is cooperation.
Yeah.
Right? Like sending if a game crashes, sending the little note that says this is what happened when the game crashed is cooperation in developing the game, right?
Yeah.
But it's not part of the game, and I understand that we're digressing into other things.
So 3 major types of cooperation plus sub-cooperation, which can also be any one of those 3 types.
Yep.
Now let's talk about cooperative games more generally. So I want to ask you a question, Vi, and this is the thing I sent in the notes because my note section was very, very small.
I love getting asked questions.
That's so sarcastic.
Sorry.
You never know the questions. I never brief you.
No, never. And so I always sit here just like, oh God. What fresh hell is this?
Normally it's fine.
Except in as few words as possible, and my brain short circuits. And I'm like, I do the words. That's my, I do the words. I write. That's my, you want less? No.
Okay. So here's the question. And I think this is the heart of why you wanted this episode. Why do we care about cooperative games? Actually, not why do we? Why should we? Where people currently really are cooperative or competitive or single.
Yeah.
Why should they have this middle cooperative category?
Yeah. We're asking this in the sense of like human existence. Why should we play cooperative games?
Yeah. And also why should, and I'll talk about this afterwards, of why from a design perspective are cooperative games valuable. But let's focus on the human existence part first. Over to you.
This is 2 things for me. One of them is simply like the same reason I think people should play tabletop RPGs, right? You learn empathy and let's not use cooperation in the definition, but like you learn how to be social with people and to solve problems, right? If you're playing something like, so my brother and I played, We Were Here, which has some pretty major flaws, including some glitches that make the whole thing crash. But it's the kind of thing where like you are both experiencing very different games, but you have to be communicating, otherwise the other person can't step out. One person is trapped and the other person is trying to help them solve the problems. This is also keep talking and nobody explodes.
Oh, that is another actually really imbalanced or asymmetric cooperative game.
That one's actually fantastic because, my brother and I have 2 very different skill sets, right? I am great as the manual player on that one. And this game, for people who haven't played it, please do. You only have to buy it once, only one person has to
Only
have
one
it.
person has to buy
Yeah,
it.
and that's the great thing about it. So the person who has the game on the computer is presented with a bomb, which is not like it's sort of suitcase shaped, and then it has a bunch of puzzles on it. The other person has a PDF of a manual of defusing a bomb. And the communication under a time limit, right? This is a diffuse it before it explodes kind of thing, is you have to talk about what puzzles you have and what the puzzles say, and the other person has to tell you how to solve it. So it's stuff like how many, I have a series of wires, I have 5 wires, and then the other person goes, okay, do you have 2 white wires? Do you have 1 yellow wire? Because then the instruction manual says, like, if you have this combination of things, do this. And that's awesome. It's a really good game to play generally, but it's also really, really good at breaking down how you can clearly communicate with another person under a time pressure, right? Because it can't be, I have some wires. Oh, which wires do you have? It has to be like, you have to get really good. You have to be like wire. Like when you get down to the harder levels, it has to be like wires, 5, and then you start to learn what the manual says as the person defusing the bomb. And then the person as the manual gets really good at distilling information that they're hearing from a particular person and playing it and reading it, right? And figuring out what they need to do.
Yeah. So to distill the entire description down for the purposes, it teaches teamwork.
Yeah.
It teaches cooperation, using the same word, and it teaches effective socialization.
Yes, and communication as part of socialization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is true for non-strict cooperation games or like non-time pressured games as well. Like in Portal 2, sometimes you have one person who's in a maze and a person who's looking from above the maze guiding them, which you need to be able to tell each other, how do you do that? How do you go through the maze? How do you complete this puzzle? Where's the items you need?
If you're looking for a game to play that's free, that sort of thing happens in Unsolved Mystery, Unsolved Case.
Something like that.
It's one of the two. Where you are both in similar conditions, but one person will have the answer and the other person will have, but it flips back and forth, whereas we were here tends to be like one person is trapped and in danger and the other person has some answers. Unsolved Mysteries kind of flips back and forth of like, do this, and this person sees this other thing happen.
Yeah.
I will also say, like, again, growing up with a younger brother, doing something that is cooperative tends to also let people who don't have the same skill set, or just experience, also play a game with you.
Yeah. That's more of a game design thing, and I'll definitely get into that in my segment. But there is a couple more things about the whole psychological humanity reasons why we should be focused on cooperative games. And a big one is competitive games are fundamentally aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
And look, I'm not going to be one of those people who says video games cause violence. I'm not going to be one of those people.
Nah. And we're going to talk about the psychology of video games in the next couple of episodes.
Yep, in a few episodes that's coming up.
And at no point in any of my research have I been like, this encourages violence.
What I will say, though, is competitive games are competitive. They're aggressive. Mm-hmm. They teach you how to handle competitive situations, but also that's all they are is competitive. You're against someone.
Yeah.
In many ways. And this is one thing I read online, so I actually want to really jump into it. Most competitive games are zero-sum games. One person wins, one person loses. Yeah. 2 people win, 2 lose. Equal win, equal loss. The net result is 0.
Yeah.
And humans have a negativity bias. So
if you have zero-sum games, you're always going to feel like you're losing.
Even let's say you're on the winning team, other people are on the losing team getting zero-sum losing games. So it's one of these things of cooperative games allow for this alternative to this constant zero-sum, I'm losing negativity bias.
I find personally they tend to be way more satisfying when you reach the win condition.
Yes.
Because you've had to work to get to it, and you've had to actually like have human connection to do it. Whereas sometimes when you're playing a solo game or a competitive game, this is the same point you're making, but once you reach the win condition, it kind of feels a little bit hollow because it's like, I did it.
But I will say, when I did my research and basically was reading people's opinions on Reddit at this point for this one.
Research.
Well, for this specific thing it is. I wanted to get an idea of how people feel about the games. Perfect 50-50 split.
Yeah.
between competitive and cooperative.
For sure.
The competitive player said, it feels really good to overcome another person actively working against me and to be successful.
Yeah.
And the other people said, it feels good to work with someone and find joint success.
Yes.
I think this is a really split thing, but it's surprising how many games are competitive when the opinion seems to be 50-50.
Yeah.
Now, I bet if you did a real poll, it'd be like 60-40 or something.
Sure.
In favor of competitive, personally.
Yeah.
But still, that's a lot of people who want cooperative games.
I think it also speaks to just like how games are made.
Yeah.
And the fact that we started kind of with competitive games and
That is
cooperative is
the
a little bit
easiest to
new,
do.
right? It's the easiest one to make, and I think that's why we see a bias
Yeah.
to having more of them.
We're also seeing a growth in cooperative games, especially in terms of board games and card games.
Yeah.
Even, I wanted to avoid this game for this episode, but I actually want to say this here. There is such thing as competitive cooperative games, and that's like Among Us. The whole goal is to work
Yeah.
together, but one or two people are trying to make you work against each other.
Yeah.
And that's competitive. It's team versus team.
Yeah.
But it's fundamentally trying to be cooperative and trying to sabotage cooperation.
Yeah.
Which is I really like that that's becoming a genre. This competitive
Yeah.
cooperative is becoming a genre.
It really, that one for me is so good because if you are a player who really enjoys cooperation, then you are really going to enjoy being part of the team that's like trying to catch the thief.
Yeah.
Or
Or-
the assassin, right?
The
What it
imposter.
imposter, thank you.
But
It's
you
not
might
COVID
also
anymore.
enjoy being in the imposter who's working with one other person
Yeah.
while sneaky.
Yes.
Right?
Right. If you're more competitive, you might enjoy that. I think that one speaks to the breadth of players more than
Yeah,
a strictly cooperative or a strictly competitive game does.
But I think because of how it's defined, you have a person who likes cooperation now has to think, how do I screw up cooperation? And that's fun. That's good for the cooperative player. And a competitive player thinks, how do I work around this hurdle? I think it is one of the few games that's accessible to all of these things. But now that we have an idea of the psychology, I want to talk about why cooperative games benefit game design and game companies. So I have a few points on this I really wanted to mention. And the first one is actually one of the most simple points in that a competitive game requires building a very large skill set.
Yeah.
How do you build a skill set or a set of like the ability to play a game? You either play a long time and practice, or you spend a lot of money. That's not accessible to the entire player base. Some people don't have a fortune to spend on games, and some people don't have hundreds of hours to spend on games.
Yeah.
But those are still people who want to buy games.
Yeah.
As a game company, you always want to expand your market.
Yeah.
And there's a market of people who don't have time or money but want to play games.
Yeah.
And there's a market of people who want to play games with their friends with this limited time and money.
Mm-hmm.
And those are still people who will pay maybe not hundreds but tens of dollars
Yeah.
each. And then if you get thousands of those people, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
Like that's a full market.
For sure.
And for game design or for game companies, it's really beneficial because now you have more markets you can tap into, more people buying your games. You get more money as a company.
Mm-hmm.
And as a gaming community, this is good because we're engaging more people with more ideas who might want to give feedback on games and help us make better games. And these people might not have the time to put hundreds of hours into the game, but they might have a 15-minute break where they jump onto the subreddit for the game and make a better community.
Yeah. And it also speaks to like, you know, if you have more opinions, as in all things, you might find that one thing that you weren't thinking about when you were making the game.
Yeah.
Right? Somebody jumping on like a Stardew Valley board and being like, oh, we should add this. And the developer being like, that actually solves these 12 problems I've been trying to think about how to fix.
Yeah.
Right? And the
You're
more
inviting more perspectives.
Yeah, this is a tangent of tangents, but there is a watchmaker from my hometown that was making watches out of old pocket watch pieces. And my dad found him, loved his stuff, thought it was super cool. Couldn't go pick up the watches that he bought, so mom went. And then Mr. Watchmaking guy was like, oh, you're an artist. You should design some watches because I'm kind of out of ideas. She was like, oh, interesting. So, you know, she offered to like design some watches and give some feedback. And she bought one of the watches. Never wears it because she has one that she loves. I stole it because I loved that watch. Like, and I was like, you're not wearing this. And I went home for Christmas and I was like, and I will be. And then something happened where like, it was a very minor repair thing that happened. It was just like, I had a spring bar, which is the bit that holds the like strap into the lugs, kept falling out. Just weird. And And so when I was home, I took it to the watchmaker and I was like, I love this watch. I wear this watch every day. I need you to fix this. He was like, oh, for sure, definitely. And so my brother and I are in his basement, right, looking at the new watch that he hasn't released yet and stuff. And we're talking about how he's designing other watches. And he goes, the more people who are interested in my watch, right, and in the stuff I'm making, the more feedback I get, the more buy-in I have from people who already enjoy what I make, the better those watches get. So if you have input on the next watch, please tell me, because it makes the stuff better. And that Yeah, I mean, and if you're interested in a Canadian-made watch, Barrington Griffith's watch is so good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's exactly it. Having a more variety in your community, having more people engaging, more people care about things and engaging in their unique ways.
Yeah.
It makes better games, and very, very importantly, because of how toxic the community can often be, it builds a better community.
Yeah, if you feel heard, you're going to want that thing more.
Yeah.
Right?
And also having a community that helps people and that is friendly and encourages more people to play games and is making content like art and music for games is better. It makes an overall better community.
We talked about this when we were talking about cosplay.
Yeah, when we had our artist episode.
Yeah, definitely. When you have something that people are invested in and you encourage their investment in that thing, and I don't mean like monetarily necessarily.
Yeah.
I mean just like
promote it.
The stuff that they're doing because they enjoy the game.
Yeah.
Right? If you go, oh, this person, somebody is writing fan fiction about these two characters, right? Maybe on the next patch we go add a romance arc that people can find. And then when people who have written the fan fiction for that find it, they're going to go insane.
You know what's wild? That happened in Stardew Valley.
Did it? That's so
because there were
funny.
two characters. It's Emily and I can't remember his name now. The alcoholic. Where they weren't marryable or dateable characters.
Yeah.
Emily is in like her late 30s and the alcoholic's an alcoholic.
Yeah.
I can't remember his name and I keep wanting to say Sean and it's not Sean.
Okay, but there's this other character.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the game developer did a poll of 4 guys and then 4 girls, and you can vote for which one from each category would be dateable. And these two won the poll and became dateable characters in the game.
Yeah.
Because feedback from the community.
Yes.
And the character Emily, who's kind of the best description I can give of her is a crystal mommy. That's what she is. That's what she's called. Yeah. I don't like it, but anyways.
Don't like that you said it on air.
It's on air. But that's what people call her, and she's a great character. She's a lot of people's favorite character.
Yeah, exactly.
Because she's so well written, and she was already well written without the dating element.
Yes.
And the dev was very careful to make these dating elements not shallow.
Yeah.
And this is true for the character who's an alcoholic. He actually goes through a whole round of dealing with his problems and growing as a person, and it's great.
Which never would have happened if he hadn't asked his audience, who do you want to see, like,
dateable,
dateable, right?
Which is such a wild question that leads to such a wholesome outcome.
I think the dateable thing there is, who do you want to see more of?
Who do you want a deeper story of?
Yeah. And that's really the question they're asking there. So to say, like, these two characters are interesting and I want to know more about them, and the way that game is built is you have to date them. So yeah, that's super cool. Yeah. It's the more people feel heard about a game, the better the game gets for the people who like it already.
Yeah. And cooperative games give an easier environment for those people to engage. Mm-hmm. And that's the big takeaway from this entire thing. Not just we need better communities, we need games that are more welcoming to people in these communities. Yeah. This is why casual games are so good as well. Like Candy Crush is great for the community, even though it sounds weird to say that. Yeah. But there's one more game design aspect that's really positive from cooperative games I want to talk about.
I forgot that Candy Crush is a game that still exists.
Still widely played.
Because in my brain, it exists in the Subway Surfer cut the rope genre.
It does.
Where they don't
It basically
exist.
founded the genre.
Yeah. Where it doesn't, those games don't exist anymore. So I'm like, oh, Candy Crush obviously shouldn't
Subway
exist.
Surfer
but it
still
does.
exists.
What?
Yeah. That's still a thing. As far as I know. It's in the background of every single TikTok Reddit reading video.
I thought that they were old.
This is still a thing. Anyways, moving on to the next game design feature. So there's one more major game design feature from cooperative games that are very important for the community. And that's the game design community has struggled for a very long time for developing games that are accessible to everyone.
Yeah.
And when I say accessible to everyone, I do mean disabilities, but more important, like more for this side of things, it's games that are accessible to children and games that are accessible to the elderly.
Yeah.
People who literally lack some degree of either physical or mental ability to engage with a game.
Yeah.
And let's imagine you play a competitive racing game versus a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
Who wins?
Well, you do.
versus an 80-year-old who has lost a lot of their reaction time.
Yeah.
Who wins?
Well,
You do.
You do.
The
Yeah.
beauty of cooperative games is it bridges these age and skill gaps. Let's say,
This is where I was trying to go with playing with a younger brother.
Yes,
Except
yes.
that he's often much better at things than I am. So not a one-to-one
but once
comparison.
upon a time, that was important.
Yeah.
And this is why I said I would come back to it, because in terms of game design, cooperative games give us a way to build games that tap into the not a gamer market.
Yeah.
Which I don't like using the word gamer. I still hate it.
What
but
what is the game that's on Switch? Is it Ori and the Blind Forest that's cooperative where you can have another
think
it's a
so.
split screen cooperative game?
Not sure, but there's tons of split screen
things
cooperative
like
games.
this.
You're not going to
Yeah.
find it with that Google search. I see you on your phone.
Don't call me out.
I'm calling you out on air.
I want to know.
But very importantly, it has been very hard for years to make games that are accessible to all audiences. You see a lot of these games rated E for everyone, and what that means is they're designed for 12-year-olds and the adults can play them if they want. But when we talk about cooperative games, we're dealing with situations where, yeah, less skilled players can play. If you're playing the Portal 2 cooperative, you put the good player in the hard part and the worst player in the easier part, and you still have to work together.
Yeah.
Right? When you're playing D&D, the new player can help as much in new events as the experienced player because they have different characters with different skill sets, and they can be guided together.
Yes.
When you have an old player playing a cooperative game, like It Takes Two, you can help guide them on what to do and work together to have a rewarding experience for both of you.
For sure.
Right?
There is something I think to be said here about people who return to gaming
Yes.
after a gap. Like my dad comes back to me, and I'm sure there are other people who are in this situation too, where, you know, he played like Final Fantasy. Like we made Discord accounts to play D&D online.
Yes.
And he chose a Final Fantasy character as his avatar. He was like, I want that guy. And I was like, why do you know who this person is? Right? Played like 2nd edition and original D&D. And then I brought them back to 5th edition, right? And sort of into modern gaming, right? Just sort of playing around them. Right? There's an obviously like they developed a skill and then there's a gap between playing. So this genre of games of like new players also brings people who have taken a break from gaming sort of back into the fold.
Yeah. And of course, there's the monetary advantage for companies of tapping into new markets. But
Yeah.
importantly, this means that people who can't usually play games or engage with this entire multi-billion-dollar industry and community can play games.
Yeah.
And importantly, and this is actually, to me, one of the most important parts from a human psychology level,
Right.
you can engage with your loved ones across generational and skill boundaries.
Yeah.
And that's like psychologically important.
Yeah.
But let's also think about this from game design.
I just want
Suddenly-
to shout out, the Wii thing where like you could just hand the remote to your grandpa and be like, I'm gonna play this game. You can collect some stars.
Yes, that
Yeah.
was Galaxy, Mario Galaxy.
Yes.
Yes. But in terms of game design, this is also very useful. And I've actually not seen people talk about this. Very seriously, I didn't watch any extra credits for this episode. I have no source. I don't have that source.
I'm sorry, you didn't.
They
you
have-
didn't
they have,
go
like,
to our wellspring.
They
of
have
an-
like 7 episodes on it, and I have watched them years ago, so I know I'm pulling that information from somewhere in my memory. But I didn't watch them this time. Mainly because I was preparing 2 episodes simultaneously and cared.
No, I forgive you for not. Yeah.
But importantly, it means that we now have an avenue for doing game research, game design exercises, and like game development tool or research for audiences that don't usually play games. We can learn how to engage people who don't normally play games.
I understand
and
what you're
learn
saying.
how to make these games more accessible to them.
Right.
And make games that are good for these people who don't usually play games.
You are looking at the cooperative game as a stepping stone to making games for people who don't normally play.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it means that we also learn how to build games in a more accessible way.
Mm-hmm.
For example, an older member of an audience, if you're building a game that's cooperative or accessible for them, in playtesting, they might say, I'm having a hard time reading this.
Yeah.
And now you have just developed a way of making more readable text that would be useful in a competitive game and in a single player game. Or someone who doesn't play games says it's in playtesting again, or even in feedback later, it was unclear how to do this and I had to ask my family member who was playing with me how to do it.
Yeah.
Now the developers know how to build better tutorials.
Yeah.
You're
And-
now tapping into a new way of engaging people.
You're also having a different avenue of communication, which is, you know, if you have somebody who is, let's say, older, right, and then you are somebody who is, you know, active on online communities and like talking to developers and stuff,
Yeah.
right? If you are able to take that feedback and hand it over, it's really easy to just say like, hey, they made this adjustment, Grandpa. Do you want to talk to them and tell them what your experience is like, right? You've just opened up not only like another avenue of communication, but you've built a relationship between two people.
Yeah.
Which is
and
cool.
This is something that the Wii was really good at. The Wii didn't just do cooperative, it also did accessible competitive. But the Wii did it a lot.
It's so funny to me to come back to thinking about the Wii after growing up with it as the way it developed accessibility. Right? Like we keep coming back to the Wii when we talk about game development because it was this whole other like strategy, right? It was like totally odd, but it was just because they wanted to make a console with motion controls and then found that was more accessible for younger players and older players.
It wasn't just motion controls. They had two goals. It was they want to do these new technologies, and they wanted to engage a market that doesn't usually play games, which means casual, cooperative, or soft competitive games. Like Wii Sports is competitive in practice.
Yes.
Right?
Right, but it's also like it was engaging with the younger markets.
Yeah.
Right? Like this is a console that people bought for children.
Yeah.
That was its main use.
And if people want to hear more about this topic as well on game research and figuring out how to make accessible games, I'd recommend they go back and listen to our episode with Dr. Scott Bateman on game research.
Yeah.
Because we talked about this during game research. How do you make better games? You engage academia who researches how to make better games.
Yeah.
And this, I've had many discussions with Scott Bateman, and this is the exact thing we talked about, making games more accessible. And we never came to the topic of cooperative games. We came to other topics, but it's the same idea.
Yeah. Yes.
And this is why you, as a listener, should care about cooperative games. They're fun, they're engaging, they have a different type of reward, but it's still a very positive reward. They let you spend time with your loved ones in a way that is very positive. And it might just make us be able to make better games, which is the point of the show, to help you make and play better games.
Yeah.
And that's about everything, I think.
Awesome.
So
what a cool episode. What a cool way to frame different kinds of gaming.
Yeah. I think it's very important to think there's more outside of what we just normally play, and that's good.
Yes. I think there's definitely something to be said for if you haven't tried a game like this, go try one, right?
Yeah.
If you're a person who already has a gaming community, go try a cooperative one just to see why we think it's important.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's everything. So thank you so much for listening for today's episode on cooperative games. And I hope I see you in our later episodes where we talk about how to make and play better games in other ways.
Yes.
So thank you so much for listening. I've been Gaia.
And I've been Vi.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye.
And that's it for today's episode. But what if you wanted to listen to more? Well, our new episodes come out every Thursday at 9 p.m. Atlantic, and there are 3 different ways that you can listen. If you're in the Fredericton area of New Brunswick, Canada, you can listen live on CHSR 97.9 FM through any of your radio services. If you're not in this region or you prefer using the internet, you can tune in on chsrfm.ca at the same time, 9 p.m. Atlantic. As well, we release all of our episodes on a number of podcasting platforms online, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. So if you wanted to, you could go back right now and listen to Season 1, where Vi and I do a deep dive into the fundamental concepts of game design, rather than the hardware they'll be taking up this season. Anyways, thank you for listening, and have a good one.